So welcome to Impress Education's third webinar, and it's on an inspector calls. So why did we choose an inspector calls? We chose it because colleagues' English departments have asked for some support in teaching this effectively and getting the right results. Okay, what are the particular challenges of teaching an inspector call? You've got to contend with the fact that there's no extract in this exam question, and it sits within literature paper 2, the toughest and longest exam of the lot. Stickability in terms of writer's purpose, quotations and plot details. It's incredibly frustrating when they've learnt this in year 10 to revisit it in year 11 and find that they can't remember anything. Another challenge is the era complexity. So it's using the Edwardian era to scrutinise the contemporary post-war era, and students find that difficult to grapple with. There's a lack of juicy quotes, in my opinion. Juicy means words that have connotations, and I find it very easy to help students analyse Shakespeare and Dickens, but when it comes to analysing hard-headed practical man of business, that's where you struggle, because you've got polysyllabic words, but it's difficult to explore the connotations of those words. Then you've got the dramatic element to contend with, and that's it. So those are the challenges we face within inspector calls. So I'm going to run through today a teach meet on the important elements of making sure that your students do the best that they can for this exam question. I like to keep things simple and effective, and I have got in front of you now a catch-all, simple document that the students can refer to. In this document, you can see how to write a thesis statement. You've got a mnemonic to help recall the contextual features, the 4 main themes, the success criteria for writing an analytical paragraph, and then the key quotations, the very important quotations for each aspect of the play. So let's start with the mnemonic. Try to get your students to know this off by heart. As soon as they open that exam paper and they're faced with those 2 inspector calls questions, they're able to write down this mnemonic. So let me take you through it. First World War. This is an anti-war play. Priestley himself experienced, fought in the war and had those experiences, and he was incredibly anti-war, even during the Second World War. In addition to that, for the First World War, there were changes afoot. The classes mixed, and people realised that working class people were just as effective leaders and soldiers as those people that were given the privilege of being in charge. Also, when all of the men returned from the First World War, the women had discovered that they were just as good as men at working. So we came back to a more diverse kind of society. F for factory. We need to remember and try to weave into our responses the importance that Priestley worked in a factory when he's 16 years old, and he was appalled by the conditions that those workers had to face. The Edwardian era was characterized by decay and decline, and that is symbolized in the failure of the Titanic and the sinking of the boat. Another aspect is the genre of the play, which is well-made play. I often mention that to students, but if I'm working with a high ability group, I go into that in more detail, but that's something to be aware of. The welfare state. Goodness me, I don't think I've ever taught any students that had any knowledge of this. So you're going to have to do your kind of background information. I suggest showing them some videos on what happened with the welfare state and getting them to do some knowledge retrieval quizzes, talking about the emergence of the NHS, workers' rights, all of the kind of little bits and pieces that were put in place post-Second World War to help the Eva Smiths of the world. Then you've got socialism. Of course, it's a socialist play. Priestley is socialist, and so is his mouthpiece, Inspector Gulf. So making sure that socialism is in there and it's in that thesis. Likewise, the same with capitalism and how capitalist views are represented by the Burling family. Materialism and the fact that people are motivated by money and wealth. Let's not forget that this isn't really an engagement party as such, it's a business deal, and with the 2 kind of successful families coming together. It's more of an arranged marriage, and they want wealth and they want power. And then finally, post-war, P, recognizing that this play was actually written and performed for the first time in the post-war period. And that contextual mnemonic says, few skimp with a C. It's not perfect, but it is something that can be remembered by students and recalled, and that's what's important. Then you've got your important and key quotations. Now, I think an often neglected part of the key quotations are our first impressions of these characters. These can be our opening quotations, and focusing also on the stage directions. These are easy wins. That beginning of the play, there is a huge amount of material there to analyse and use in our exams. Now, let's look at the description of Sheila. And she's described as pretty, which is kind of placing her within a patriarchal society and being judged by her appearance. And also pretty as an adjective and as a stage direction demonstrates that she's girlish, even though you normally wouldn't describe someone in their 20s as being pretty. It would usually be, as a woman, it would be attractive. So there are connotations there to explore. She's also very pleased with life. And then you can talk about the lighting and the importance of that. Pink and intimate at the beginning, and brighter and harder when the inspector arrives. And then if you move on to some more important quotations with Act 1, there are the obvious ones there, but my go-to quotations would be the stage directions, again, to describe the two children. Half shy, half assertive. That's obviously good examples of juxtaposition there. And the repetition of the half shows that Eric has a lack of identity and he's confused. He's being brought up by capitalists, but he doesn't completely buy into their values. And then I think you need to have a breadth of quotations. And so I've got some important quotations to Act 2, but the one my go-to really is giving us rope so that we'll hang ourselves. This is Sheila using an interesting metaphor, a disturbing metaphor to describe her death, but it could also be symbolic of her dying, her death as a capitalist and her rebirth as a socialist, a potential socialist. And then obviously you've got the very important quote where how the inspector finishes the play. That's a definite quote that has to be referred to regardless of what the question is or what the essay is. And if they will not learn this lesson, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Obviously, it's very biblical. And why is Priestley using Christian imagery and biblical imagery? Because he's trying to suggest that you can't be a Christian without being a socialist. Christianity and socialism go hand in hand. And if we don't change our ways, then we're going to end up following the cycle and we're going to go into another war like he'd experienced firsthand in the First World War and witnessed in the Second World War. So that quotation is an absolute must. It's a key quotation for any essay because it embodies Priestley's message through Inspector Gould, who is his mouthpiece. And he clearly uses Christian imagery because he's trying to make the link between Christianity and socialism, which is in some ways maybe a jarring idea, but he's trying to demonstrate to his capitalist audience that if they're going to be Christians, they have to be socialists, and it's natural, bees in a hive, natural imagery. So let's go through a thesis statement. In his didactic play, this is how I drill the students. They're going to start with that opening sentence, and Inspector calls J.B. Priestley, and then you address the question. There's an argument to be had that the best question to go for is a thematic question because you're going to be able to demonstrate your knowledge and talk about context in more detail. In terms of what I think are the key the key things you have to talk about, in my opinion, are Sheila Burling. Why do you need to talk about Sheila Burling? Because she's the character that goes through the transformation. She goes on a journey from a selfish capitalist to an enlightened and awakened socialist. And she's the one that's willing to change. In addition to that, you've got the most important theme of them all, in my opinion, which is the message of social responsibility, which is also demonstrated through the other themes of class, gender, and hierarchy. So it all comes back to the importance of embracing social responsibility. Now, if you get a question on Mrs. Burling, then you just you just contrast, you talk about Mrs. Burling's journey also, but she doesn't change, but you just contrast her with the journey of Sheila, and you talk about that in your thesis statement, and then you've covered your bases. So I do believe that having a focus on Sheila and social responsibility are winners, and I've gone through every single past paper, and although there's some pivots to be made, those are very powerful ideas to look at. So let's look at how you do a thesis statement. You address the question, and then in your second sentence, you summarize the journey of the character you're looking at or the theme in one sentence in relation to the question, and then you try to use some contextual vocabulary. For instance, talking about the Edwardian era, talking about patriarchy, talking about the clash between the ideologies of socialism versus capitalism. And then finally, in your third sentence, in the thesis statement, you explain what the writer's purpose was or intention was. Clearly, I think you need to talk about the importance of social responsibility. And then that's it. Just a kind of an amendment to Sheila. When she's offered the ring back, she says not yet, which does heavily imply that she's going to go back into the fold of capitalism. But then you can talk about the fact that she has this awareness, but because she exists within a patriarchal structure and society, it's a lonely out there, and she perhaps doesn't want to end up like Daisy Renton or Eva Smith. So maybe we should cut her some slack. And perhaps there is a suggestion there that maybe she is likely to lapse and return to the fold because operating as a socialist in upper class society is just too overpowering for one individual. So you've got your example of a typical thesis statement here. In his didactic play and in Spectacles, J.B. Priestley presents the absolute necessity of needing to embrace the values of social responsibility. Priestley does this through the character of Sheila Burling, who goes on a journey from a selfish and immature capitalist to a self-aware socialist. The playwright wanted his post-war audience to reject the Edwardian values of decline and embrace the principles of the welfare state. So this is 4-box planning, and this is what we advocate as an approach to use for all of the literature texts. And it doesn't, these are 4 main paragraphs, but it doesn't have to it shouldn't just be some kind of single quotations for each of those boxes. It's just your main ideas. Usually, because Priestley is making this didactic argument in favour of socialism, there's an argument that you structure your essay in a chronological way. Now we've reached a piece de resistance, okay? The buzzwords, the professional phrases to sound like a grade 7+. I'll just share with you a story. One of my colleagues once said to me, come and have a look at this. And she showed me a year 7 piece of work, and they sounded like a year 11 student. I said, oh my goodness, how did you achieve this? And it was all through the use of these phrases and the drilling of these phrases. So double zooming on words, the verb, something coupled with the adjective, something suggests. Also you can teach year 7 students to identify and talk about semantic fields. And then also when referring to the writer and the writer's purpose is using lots of adverbs, deliberately, carefully, intentionally, and also the phrase carefully crafts. Exploring the connotations of words are also very powerful. When reviewing students' work and essays is having a look back and making them use these phrases as often as possible to really strengthen their argument and to introduce a level of kind of professionalism to their work. Okay, so contextually speaking, and in Spectacles, 80% of students produce exams for it in the exams. It's worth 20% of the English language GCSE, which means with the English literature GCSE, now couple that with the English language GCSE, that means we should be spending 10% of our curriculum time on an Inspector Calls. Now, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but when you teach an Inspector Calls in 7 weeks in year 10, and then you reach year 11, and you turn around to students and say, give me some quotes, they know nothing, and they can remember nothing. Now when we've got so much content to teach, it fills me with despair. How do we resolve these issues?
Well, one thing I've kind of tried to revive is the kind of age-old, almost A-level habit of annotating. I feel like that we got to a point where we were moving away from annotated texts. A lot of schools were not asking students to buy their own texts even, and so they were sitting there with blank copies. So one thing I kind of really, really love to do with my students, and they absolutely love it, is using an annotation guide that I create for each text. It's a colour-coded system. It kind of focuses on themes, focuses on the linguistic and structural features, on the characters, and on context. And so not only does it leave them with a huge sense of pride, but it leaves them with a resource that they can actually revise from, a resource that they can look at home and not just in lesson when we're doing whole class reading.
Excellent. I think taking pride in your own work is so important, and that is something that you don't always experience when you visit schools. And creating a revision resource that you can actually use and looks presentable, I think that's a really good point, Miriam.
One of the things that I've tried in each of the years that I taught an inspector course is actually having class performances. So splitting the class up into groups and having the different acts, for instance, could be one way, or it could be key scenes, or it could be the fact that we have a battle of sorts between two groups that are doing the same scene. However you want to play it. Students obviously enjoy enacting it. That's one obvious plus point, but the pitfalls are that you have to clearly have a group that you've got good behaviour system set up. It can't be, oh, let's just try and act this. The amount of planning to make it work, I would argue, is 3 or 4 times the magnitude of what it would normally be to try and do it in a normal setting. So one of the things that I found is really useful is to get the head teacher involved and try and make it something that has a whole school focus. So you get people to audition in front of senior leadership, potentially for certain key parts. It doesn't necessarily have to become the production at the end of the year, but if you give it some kind of prominence, if you potentially even get the parents involved in some way, shape or form so that they get to see it too, this could be something that the students similarly take pride in themselves. And it's a play. It needs to be performed. So I find that if it's left to them having to then learn their own quotes and be off book for their key scenes in the run up to the exam, so have it as the last thing taught, then it can be something that kills 2 birds with 1 stone.
This may sound a tad mean, but actually for our first reading, I don't want anyone else reading but me. You have those keen readers who really and desperately want to read, who are going to completely miss the intonations, they're going to completely miss the dramatic pauses, they'll miss the kind of almost the underhandedness of Mrs. Burling and her kind of pompous nature. And so initially I like to read it to them with the voices and with the pauses so they can get a real feel for it. And only once we have a look at kind of context and political connections to the play do I want them then to kind of read as a whole class, because then they can begin to spot those clues for themselves.
That's really interesting. So are you suggesting that you read the play twice over the course of 7 weeks?
Well, yes, but I suppose in most schools you do revisit an inspector course in year 11, and I do think there's time for it. I think we should make the time for it.
Okay. So in terms of medium-term plans, the kind of ambition of our department was to try and cover as much of the content in year 10 as possible, so that it leaves you space to interleave. You never stay on a topic for more than 2 weeks, and then there's some sort of assessment piece that they have to do in year 11. So, and interleaving has been proven to be a very powerful learning aid and memory tool. Something also that I advocate is giving year 11s or year 10s a sheet of paper and getting them to retrieve and recall the quotations or the writer's purpose, so that they know they're put under pressure. Because the amount of times when I've been working for Impress and I've got into a school and said, right, Have you got 20 quotes for Inspector Calls? Have you got 20 quotes for Macbeth? Have you got 20 quotes for A Christmas Carol? And then you'll need 2 quotes per poem. That's roughly 100 quotations you need to know off by heart. And they just look at me like I've come from Mars. And I think that importance of learning quotations and knowledge has to be embedded much lower down.
I don't know. Maybe it's because my youngest is 9, and then a 10-year-old as well. Both of them are involved in theatre, so both of them are regularly having to go off book. So the passion for rote learning of scripts is something that I forgot how much children can enjoy it if they are given the right circumstances over the whole of Key Stage 3, I would argue. So if you're expecting suddenly for your English department to have a bunch of performances going on, and this is like left to the end of the year 11, it's simply not going to happen. But if it's something, you know, interwoven within the fabric and the culture of the school, that there is an expectation that you are going to have to recite poetry, for instance, a whole poem, you know. I remember my English teacher used to jump on the desk and be Richard III, you know, now is the winter of our discontent. I remember doing that in Malaysia when I was there with my first year, and the ceiling fan clocked me on the head and soon stopped me trying that again. But I really do think there is a missed opportunity to trust students to find a different set of voices through memorising quotations. If English departments can't be the last kind of bastions or champions, you know, for students having a chance to find their voices and enjoy the best, you know, versions of themselves through extraordinary literature, then it's a sad, you know, day, isn't it?
So, and in spectacles, I don't know about the two of you, but my non-negotiable, for example, is that in the thesis statement, they should always talk about context. And in their conclusion, for example, in their kind of closing paragraph, I always want them to talk about the ending of the text, why it ends in that way, and why the characters end up in that way, for example. What would be your advice for the thesis and the conclusion? Because that is the million-dollar question for our students, isn't it?
Yeah, I think time and time again, when you come into contact with students, they don't know how to write a thesis statement. There's an inability to do those things, and that's what they need support in. And it's quite clear that if you want to get a grade 7, 8, 9, you have to have a thesis. You have to have an argument, you have to back it up. Now, actually looking at the mark scheme and reading the examiner's reports, they don't say that you have to have a thesis, but it does support the whole process of developing and building an argument over the course of an essay. So thesis is important, and of course, you can't have a thesis statement without talking about the context in an Inspector Calls or in any of them. So there should be a reference to the Edwardian era, the fact that it's an anti-war play, for instance. There should be a reference to the class system. There should be obviously reference to the conflict that exists with it and the dramatisation of capitalism v socialism, and patriarchal society. Those are kind of phrases that need to be in the thesis in some way. And your point about the end of the play is something that, and this is why I enjoy having these discussions and why we as teachers should have them, is I don't think it's something that I do, and I think I agree with you. I think it's something that moving forward departments should refer to the end of the play. But to throw it back at you, Miriam, what do we say?
Ultimately, I need my students at the end of their essays to talk about the way in which, for example, Priestley has ended it. I mean, that's a challenge in itself, isn't it? Dealing with our literal readers and consoling them when they don't get the ending that they feel the play deserves, when they're left with so many unanswered questions. So that's exactly what I want them to talk about in their conclusion. And I want them to talk about Sheila's progression as an individual, her growth as going from kind of a girl to a lady to a woman, and having a look, of course, at that kind of generational divide and why the older characters don't make that shift.
And yeah, I think a sentence starter there is going to have to be the writer's purpose. at the end of the play, as the curtain closes, is such and such.
Now, another challenge, I'm just looking through my notes, another challenge for teaching and inspector calls is that it can sometimes be difficult to convince our wealth-obsessed Gen Z generation that it is wrong for businessmen to kind of capitalise and maximise on financial gain. And I do find that they sometimes struggle with that idea. After all, isn't that what gets him the OBE that Mr. Burling is desperately trying to catch up with?
Such an interesting point, because teaching in Essex and teaching A Christmas Carol, often you'll get students turn around and say, well, if the Cratchits can't afford to have children, they shouldn't be having children. And yeah, some of them will reluctantly agree with Burling, who's a capitalist. And has he done anything illegal? No, he hasn't. And has Scrooge done anything illegal? No. But what both texts are suggesting that we need to do is embrace social responsibility. And so if there's an absence of social responsibility in society, then the message is very, very important and relevant today.
I once spotted the difference in a reaction from students in a school where clearly they came from a more kind of deprived background, and me telling them about the lack of the welfare system and what would happen to you and your families if there wasn't a welfare system, and the stark contrast of perhaps some of the children that I also teach in Epping, in Chigwell, that just have no kind of idea of what that even means. It really plays a big part in how it lands with them and how much they embrace the idea and understand and are on side with Priestley and his political motives or his political agenda.
Yeah. What always kind of fills me with despair is how depoliticised the students are. And so there often is a lot of kind of gap filling you have to do with the students in terms of explaining the politics and the historical politics of our country, and their kind of complete ignorance of the political spectrum.
And even our history students seem to be ill-prepared. But I mean, is that harsh? I mean, they're not voting yet, but we do expect there to be a level of political awareness, and as you said, there is none of it. So there needs to be a chunk dedicated to teaching the context of that.
Yeah, and it goes back to what Stephen was saying about cultural capital and getting that opportunity to explore and live these experiences ourselves.
And I think that, this speaks to having proper curriculum planning that is cross-curricular, and so that there's a true cross-fertilisation of resources that go from 7 to 11. So having a student parliament in the school, having this that they all have to be part of from year 7 as a representative all the way through, and having mock elections. It can't be the job of the English department, to solely be the educators when it comes to socialism and capitalism and all these various things. And it would seem as if it may be light touch in some of the other subjects. So perhaps that might be one way of addressing their ignorance when it comes to these things.
I think also maybe having those mnemonics and things to kind of go, as soon as I get in that exam, I'm going to write this down on the page, because I think there is an element of panic. This is a nasty 2 out of 15 exam for them, and Inspector Calls is only one of the plates that they have to spin. They've got conflict poetry, the poetry, unseen poetry, and they'll see that question and they'll suddenly pop, they can't remember any quotes, they can't remember any context. So having that kind of safety net of a mnemonic to write down and their key quotes to write down could calm their nerves, and a half-prepared thesis statement. Okay, so I was having an interesting discussion with a colleague about an Inspector Calls, and personally it's my least favourite text to teach, and I have to make myself enjoy it, because I know that if I'm enjoying it, then the students are more likely to enjoy it. I love Macbeth, I love Christmas Carol, and I think they're both full of juicy quotations, meaning they've got words with lots and lots of connotations to them. And I explained to my colleague, I don't like an Inspector Calls because the quotes are quite bland in terms of a practical man of business. And then you have to zoom in on the word business, and there isn't much to say. The examiners say hard-headed is an adjective. Examiners don't like you talking about adjectives and zooming in on and identifying features of language. The lack of juicy quotes, for me, is an issue with this play. What do you think, Miriam?
I think you really need to emphasise with your pupils about using the stage directions. And believe it or not, there are students out there who truly believe that a quotation can only be dialogue. So having that conversation with your students and reminding them that quotations are not just dialogue between characters. The stage directions, especially in the case of An Inspector Calls, are almost juicier than the dialogue.
So speaking more about the aspect of the dramatic side of it is focusing on it being a play rather than a novella.
Absolutely, and again, that is something that they need reminding of, the difference between a play, a novel and a novella, and why that form is chosen.